So do we need, hello? Yes, okay. Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Can I ask everybody to take their seats, please?
Are we using one mic or each?
No, we've each got.
Whichever.
Andres, yeah, I hope we have enough. It's a bit.
You want me here?
Yes. Good morning, and thank you everybody for joining us for this very exciting conversation around the Tropical Forest Forever facility. Without further ado, I'm going to pass the mic quickly to Andre Hoffman, who needs no introductions, and thank you so much for hosting us here. We're really, really happy to have this space for this conversation, so thank you.
So thank you very much. Maybe I don't need an introduction, but I would have liked a bit of time to prepare myself. So it's a great pleasure to have you here today. This is a very important initiative, of course. The details of what you're going to discuss are on the screen, but I think we should just start by saying something very simple. Why should we here in Davos worry about the tropical rainforest, and in particular the Brazilian tropical rainforest? It matters for us in the long term, because that's one of the what's the word, the center of what ecosystem services can bring to humanity. If we do lose the rainforest, and in particular the Amazon, it will have influences for all of us. So there is first a moral imperative to do something for the forest and for the local population, for the indigenous people who live in the forest, but it is also an economic consideration. We can do something that is economically viable, and that's the acronym you use, TFFF, TFFF, and the TFFF is definitely a mechanism to do that. But then moral, financial, but also survival. And I think that's something we tend to forget. You know, the band of humanity is narrowing, and we need to make sure that that doesn't lead us into the wrong direction. Yesterday, for those of us who had the opportunity to see it, perhaps on the internet, we had a session with Johan Rockström in the plenary in the central hall, where we talked about how to create mechanism to bring financing to nature. That's a perfectly good model. And we preceded that conference by a short report by Johan Rockström from the Potsdam Institute of Climate, who does now a yearly check on nature, the nature health check. And the statistics are absolutely terrifying. And you know, the hockey stick effect that we all look out into our private equity sort of things is hitting us really, really hard. All the trends are going in the wrong direction. And we singled out yesterday in our conference, you were there in the second one, but not in the first one. We singled out this idea that the forest matters more than we realize. We are just on the brink of this becoming a savannization, which is not desirable. So I won't go into the details, because that's what this panel is about. But yet again, thank you very much for coming to Intent. Intent, as you've seen, is a place, but it's also a way of thinking. We want to bring together people who don't normally meet, so that we can together, in the spirit of dialogue that we have now brought to the forum, that we together do something for the future of humanity. So the idea here is not just look at the fund and have a big smile on our face. The idea is take this and go and do something with it. Change it. Change the world, because we need to. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Andre. And having Andre's support for this is absolutely pivotal as well for the entire fund in its phase of takeoff. I'm just going to quickly frame the background against which this was set, and I know I'm probably preaching to the converted or the knowledgeable in the room already, but just to remind ourselves what the ecosystem services are that are delivered by tropical rainforests, but also by, you know, our forests here in Europe or in any other part of the world. They're really our climate shield. They provide the rivers in the sky. They give us biodiversity. They give us cooling. I mean, just to remind you, a tropical tree gives the equivalent of cooling that 40 AC units do. I think that's such a staggering figure, and yet we don't have to pay for it. And we're not paying for the healthy soils. We're not paying for the wildlife we're not paying for the habitat that it provides to all of us and any other products coming out of nature. So the fact that we haven't been pricing that is really a market failure. And a market failure is also that we haven't been able to deliver value for forests standing, but only for forests being felled at the moment. So against that backdrop and that market failure, and against what Andre was just mentioning, the tipping point that the deforestation rate offers at the moment, somebody had to come up and step up with something that is so colossal that it can stand against this colossal failure. And this is what TFFF does. It's an extraordinarily innovative structure, and we will hear about the details. Thankfully, the Brazilian government took a leadership with COP30 in really driving this forward and making sure that it, by COP30, could be launched. We'll hear more about this too from João. But really, the fantastic figures that we were going to be hearing about is because we need 125 billion. We need something that is so huge to address this huge issue. And we've got the backing of, I think it's over 60 countries. We've got 6.7 billion already confirmed by very brave governments that are sitting, some of them sitting here, Norway, Brazil, but Germany's also put in money, a billion, and the Indonesian government and some other governments in Europe. We just had apparently, and João maybe can talk about this, there's been more government convening, there's other governments coming in with money. It's really creating a lot of excitement, and the governments that have put the money in are very committed to this. And the other great thing, I think, and this year's theme of the WEF is the spirit of collaboration. This is the spirit of collaboration. This is a multilateral facility where other multilateral functions are breaking down. We have something we can continue to work together, global south and global north. And I think that is the other really exciting and important aspect of this fund. It's not just the money, it's not just the ability to address a lot of issues. It's that multilateralism, and last but not least, and then I'll shut up, is the fact that it's been committed to the payments, the returns will go to indigenous people and local communities. And there's been an outreach to over 300 indigenous leaders over various years that have helped put this together. So again, it's not a colonial, here we come, we're giving you donations. No, this is payments for ecosystem services, for stewardship, which is way overdue. So I think that's the other aspect that's really important to discuss. And I'll dive into this discussion now. I'll quickly introduce all of you, or do you want to introduce yourself? No, I'll introduce you. So we have Charlotte from Bracebridge Capital Partners. She's going to be talking about the finances. João de Resende from the Brazilian government. We have Andreas from the Norwegian government. We have Kirsten, WWF International Director, and Christopher Apostol, representing private finance. So without further ado, and I hope I've given enough introduction, I'd like to jump into questions to you, João. The Brazilian government took on a leadership role. A lot of it was being done already, but you really leaned in. And President Lula had played a key role also in committing to the first billion as a government. So tell us a little bit of how that all came together so beautifully.
Yeah, is this working? Yes. So first of all, thank you for having us here. Good morning, and thank you for Xenia organizing and our hosts here for having us. It's quite a long story. I'm just going to try to give you some glimpse of what happened there. But basically was when we learned that we're going to be hosting COP30 in the middle of 2023, the Brazilian government decided that this was the first COP in Brazil, the first COP in the forest. We needed to do something big. We needed to deliver something, and not only big, but also something that was concrete and not just an agreement over an idea that someone would be discussing for the next 10 years. We wanted something that deliverable, and that's how we started to discussing ideas. And to be honest, this idea of having an endowment fund to pay for forest services has been around for over 10 years. Garo Bachmanian, which is a colleague from the Brazilian government that heads the Forest Service in Brazil, he worked in the World Bank. He knew about this idea already. We had also talked to Ken Lay, which used to be a treasurer at the World Bank, and also pushed for this many years ago. Some people in the civil society in Brazil, Tasso Azevedo and others, Ilona is here, I can't see her, but there she is. They are also talking about this already, and I was talking about this with Svetlana, which is actually in the bank, in the World Bank right now. So we said, well, this seems to be like the most promising idea that we could push for. It is. We did a lot of technical work. What's in the table today is somewhat different from where we started. Just basically, it's not any longer. We're calling it an endowment fund initially because we expected there to be grants and people donating money. Now we're talking about repayable loans, so it's more of an investment instead of a donation in that sense. And originally, I don't even know if Charlotte knew this, but we were aiming at investing in the equity market, buying shares and so on. And then we realized that fixed income would be a much better approach. And this is work that was done by one of our collaborators, Lions Head. But all this technical work was done in the past 2 years. But I think the key, most important, fundamental aspect of this whole story was the involvement and the sponsorship by the Brazilian government, especially by Minister Marina Silva, which is an internationally recognized leadership in the environmental agenda. Minister Haddad, who had the sensitivity to bring the environmental agenda to the Ministry of Finance. This is not common anywhere in the world, let alone in Brazil. It's the first time that we had a unit for environmental policy and green industrial policy and so on in the Ministry of Finance. And of course, President Lula, who led this whole process. We were able to involve civil society and NGOs. WWF were with us since the very beginning. It's great to see Kristen here. But I think that the one single event that made the whole difference, and if I could, just pick one in this whole process, was the moment that Brazilian government decided that they would be the first ones to invest, and not only to invest, but to make a considerable investment, Andres. and that is, I think, that perhaps is the most important innovation in this process, because it's always been, a one-way street. It's always money coming as a donation to the South, global South. And so we believe so much in this idea, let's take the first step. And this resonated really well within the Norwegian government. Minister Andreas Eriksson, which is not this guy over here. Here's Andreas as well, but he's not a minister yet, but he will be one. But his boss, Andreas Eriksson, spoke at the United Nations General Assembly, said, we need to be flexible and bold. And that's exactly what they did. They came up with a very strong support that they had to, find ways around the bureaucracy to get that done. And then from then on, President Lula went to Indonesia, got a birthday gift of $1 billion for the TFFF from the president of Indonesia. So that's also excellent. And more and more countries started to come along, and we're pretty sure that many more will come. So I guess that kind of is the gist of it. Could go on forever, so I'll stop here.
It's been very serendipitous the way it's come together in a way. Yeah.
It has.
But with COP30 over, obviously Brazil still holds the presidency until November this year. You have elections coming up this year, so how much can the Brazilian government still continue to play a role, and how do you see that coming together?
Well, Brazil is not only the first one to decide to invest into this, but also the country that has the largest tropical forest in the world. So I don't think this can happen without Brazil. We're certainly going to be there sitting on the table. I think what changes now is that, and it's a good change, it is that we have others joined us, and we hope that they will help co-lead this process. President Lula talks a lot about multilateralism. He believes in negotiated solutions, and so we'll be there. We'll be leading the two efforts that we need to do, which is, actually setting up the institutions that we need to set up and continue fundraising. And of course, we're not going to have, being very honest, we're not going to have the same, drive that we had because we had a COP deliverable, but we really want to make this happen. This is something important to the president himself. People who were there in I think Andreas was there in the United Nations General Assembly meeting, how happy and enthusiastic he was about the whole thing, like how when countries started raising their hands and saying that they're going to invest. I think it touched him in a very personal way. So yeah, we're still going to be on the leadership, but hopefully with others.
And that's a great segue to you, Andreas, because I know that you've been personally also very invested in getting Norway along, and now you're the biggest single investor country with $3 billion committed to certain conditions, and he will talk about this. So was it difficult to convince the colleagues in the government, and was it a long journey for Norway to come to the table as well?
No. I'm not going to lie, it was obviously a big decision, and big decisions take a certain process in every government. I do have to say we had an excellent working relationship across government to get this done, with Minister of Finance, Foreign Affairs, all ministries with stake in this, and with the Prime Minister's office. I think the intent of this, the purpose of supporting tropical rainforests was an easy sell. It's been our most important NICFI, Norway's International Climate Forest Initiative, that I lead. This has been the most important international engagement of Norway in the climate and nature space for more than 15 years. We've spent more than $5 billion in grants to tropical rainforest protection, and we have extended this initiative until 2035. So we have a long strategic planning horizon to continue this systemically important work for the world. So the substance was an easy sell, and as part of our strategy, it's always been to provide systems for predictable, results-based incentives to tropical rainforest countries that deliver results. We've done that in other ways. We've done that bilaterally with Brazil and the Amazon Fund. We've done it by promoting high-integrity forest carbon markets, like we do through the LEAF Coalition, which I know has also been discussed here in Davos. We still think that is critically important in the near term to drive down emissions in the next 5 to 10 years. But we also do think there's a critical need for a long-term signal to tropical forest countries, that it's not just about reducing deforestation here and now, but recognizing what you said initially about the ecosystem services necessary for protecting forests. So, tropical rainforest protection, the mismatch between private and societal economics is extreme, right? So you have hectare by hectare. If allowed, it will always make sense to cut it down. Yes, we have promising bioeconomy initiatives to benefit from standing forests, but the commodity industry, the demand for food and fuel and fiber is strong. And so unless you have regulations and incentives in place, governments make a decision every year to protect the forest. So we need to put in place incentives that last, and I think this is the biggest opportunity we have seen to do so. So sorry, there was a bit of a distraction, but the process. On the hard part was, of course, to know exactly what we signed up on, right? So the financial model was a lot of work going on through last year, including through the fall when we were sort of our timelines for making a decision by Belém. It was a tight race to get the clarity we needed, but we did. We had good discussions with our Ministry of Finance. I think if the Norwegian and the German and the French Ministry of Finance signs off, I think every country should do their own homework, but I think that's already a sign that this is a serious effort with credibility. And then, of course, we did recognize that we could always go on for a year or two more to discuss the details. But sometimes there's a political moment that you have to grasp. And so I think that was certainly also a part of our decision, was to signal to the world that the countries that had been in the mix of designing this with Brazil need to go first. And we had spent time looking into the details, and many other countries that were invited to Belém had not. So it's only fair that they get time now. Not much more time. Now we have to get them. But we had sort of a head start by having been part of the design process. Ultimately, we had to make decisions under some uncertainty, especially when it comes to how much other contributions would come in. And so that was the hard part. We don't usually make sort of very forward conditional pledging. We try to be a humble, polite nation. But in this case, we did make conditions on achieving 10 billion by the end of this year, and that our share would not be too large. Not only to get others on board, but also because we think this structure to deliver on the intent needs to scale. And that's the work we have ahead of us to promote this with other countries and philanthropies. There's a lot of rich people in the world, I'm sure including in this room. So we need to have discussions across sectors. And we need to get both the traditional sort of donor countries, but also rich emerging markets to join in. And the signal from Brazil and Indonesia leading the way there, I think, is crucially important. This is an example of a new world, of a coalition of ambitious countries working together, not just the North-South, but a global effort. And so I'm very hopeful that we can advance on this in the next months and years. Thanks.
Thank you. And that kind of covered my second question for you already. So thank you. The technical team, I'm wondering whether we could have, there was a second slide, if we could have that, yes. So that just gives us some of the finance before I ask Charlotte her questions. You just mentioned it, right? The junior tranche that we're looking to fill is 10 billion. We've got 6.7 billion committed. From governments, but also, as you just said, philanthropic investors. Andrew Forrest put down 10 million through Minderoo Foundation at COP30, and we're doing a lunch with him tomorrow because we are trying to engage other leaders in this sector for this junior capital tranche. Just to give you a background, so that's really the ambition for this year. We want to get to the 10 billion, and that's the outreach. It's happening with governments, and it's happening with high net worth individuals, philanthropic investors. Investors is the key word here because it's obviously patient capital. Charlotte, over to you, because you are one of the financial architects of this structure. Can you talk us through when you joined, because that was a really pivotal moment. I remember Svetlana from the World Bank telling me, oh, it's so exciting, we've got Bracebridge now on board as well, and they're really going to change this, and it did change it. So talk us through your sort of involvement, and then please talk us a little bit through, for those of us who are not, and that includes me, financially fluent, talk us through the structure a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that it's funny, there's a lot of talk about how this is a collaborative thing between nations, between the global north and the global south. There's a lot about this structure that is inherently collaborative also between public and private markets. Many of the things that are talked about in TFFF or TFIF, which is the investment arm that's going to generate the capital for the rainforests, are not foreign to my world, the world of asset management, the world of fixed income, the world of finance. A lot of what this facility is going to do, and I think that was one of the exciting moments in this project, a lot of what it's going to do is really normal from our world. So Bracebridge Capital became involved a little less than a year ago now. As this process was moving through the World Bank, it sort of became clear that they needed someone who had a deep understanding of fixed income markets, because it will be fixed income assets. Although equities, Ken and I have talked about that, equities could have been interesting as well. Someone who would be able to talk about both the selection of the assets for the facility and then how it would be structured and how it would generate the capital that is needed for the rainforest. We were happy to come in and provide this role. And so I think in the conversations that I've been lucky enough to have with João and Andreas over these, past year, that's the other part of this is bringing sort of private capital in. And I think that's also why we're so focused on this junior tranche, because a huge part of this is actually a natural crowding in of private capital resources. So can I lever that into explaining how this works? All right, I'm sorry, this is like the boring lecture part. I actually TFIF is such a beautiful example of a structured product. I taught this at Brown University course, Financial Markets 2, earlier this year. So pardon the lecture. Here's the basic idea. In fixed income, we have a lot of different kinds of assets. The most basic ones that we all think of are the risk-free assets, government debt. They earn an interest rate that is set by central banks, by governments, by their economies. We also then have, I will call it risky debt. It is risky not just because of losses. It is risky because it has liquidity challenges, complexity, it can be difficult to source, there can be things that you need to understand about it. These bonds trade at a spread, at a higher coupon than the underlying risk-free rate. So if the 10-year is at 4.25% right now in the US government, there are a lot of corporate bonds out there that we can buy at 6.5%, 7.5%, and so on and so forth. The difference between these two, in finance parlance, we would call spread. The difference between the coupon of the risky bond and the risk-free bond. What TFIF, the financial arm of TFFF, is going to buy is these kinds of bonds. And the intention is for it to harvest this excess spread for the rainforest. Now, you've heard the word scale being used a lot. Being able to do this at scale is actually really important, not only to be able to make the payments that are necessary for rainforest preservation, it also, in a funny way, allows you to buy slightly less risky assets because you're going to have a much larger pool to buy them off of. So how is it going to achieve that? It's going to achieve that by issuing debt. It's going to use leverage. Leverage is a scary word. I promise it's actually really not in this particular context. The $25 billion from sponsor countries, which is loans that will earn the risk-free rate, will then be used to issue bonds that have protection, $100 billion worth. This $25 billion will agree that if anything goes wrong with any of the bonds in the portfolio along the way, they will absorb that loss, and the larger $100 billion senior debt will be kept safe. We do this a lot in finance. We do this a lot because there is a huge, large natural capital base that wants to buy less risky assets at a spread to the risk-free, which is what is envisioned for TFFF. TFFF, like other multilateral institutions, will issue bonds. They will be rated AAA and AA. We have done the modeling for this, and we are extremely confident that this will work. Because they will be highly rated, the amount you will pay for them will be less than what is earned on the underlying portfolio. This net excess spread, and I'm sorry, I had to use that finance word because it really elegantly describes what is happening here. That is what is being captured for the rainforest. That is what will be handed over to TFFF, the governing arm, and paid out in accordance with the measurements and sort of all the other features. A couple of notes. I did say risky, and there will be at any moment bonds that will have difficulties and will have challenges. The portfolios that we are modeling are going to be portfolios that through the years, through many cycles, we are very confident will be okay. The capital being put into TFFF is 40 years long. That is well beyond the attention span of typical private markets. So people often ask, well, why do private markets do this? And I say, well, one, 40 years is a very long time in a market that likes to think in quarters. Two, we actually kind of do. If you look at the CLO, the collateralized loan obligation market, we're basically doing this right now. But the junior investors in those are getting a very, very high return for themselves. Here, willing countries are paying that extra return away to preserve this incredibly important natural resource, while still actually getting the risk-free and having their capital preserved. For the portfolio, we also envision using screening criteria. If you think about this as an endowment for the benefit of the rainforest, it doesn't make a lot of sense to buy assets that are actively trying to kill your client. So, we've we've looked through the universe, and we're very confident that you can find this kind of risk reward without having to go into assets that are furthering the problem. And so that's really the model behind TFFF, to be able to generate, again, that kind of consistent payment from fixed income assets, which generate a consistent payment, which is why they're a nice choice to get it back to where it's needed.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. And I think that's hopefully given enough background information, but I know Charlotte is around for questions, and I will open it up to questions afterwards. So if you have any questions, please sit on them for the time being. Thank you. We're going to move over to the other aspect, now that we have the financial sort of backbone explained to us, nature aspect. I'm going to come over to you, Kirsten, as president of the WWF. I know that you're very excited about this new fund as well. Talk us through what it means also for your work, and just the idea of conservation now being an investment rather than a donation.
Thank you. I mean, it's difficult not to be excited about it, after hearing all these stories. But look, as WWF, we have been involved in a lot of the conversations from the very, very beginning on the TFFF. What makes it exciting, I think there's various angles. Number one, the whole issue around tropical forests, right? I mean, they are important locally for the indigenous people and local communities who live there, nationally, regionally, but also globally. The reality is that we are losing tropical forests at lightning speed, right? As we're doing with a lot of other important biodiversity systems. Just the Amazon alone, I think it's almost, we're getting close to the 20%, which is the tipping point, the negative tipping point I know that we're reaching. So for us, again, WWF is almost celebrating its 65th birthday. I've been in conservation for 30 years. It's all hands on deck, right? I mean, it's literally, the urgency is so huge. And, as conservationists, we have been trying to convince people for a long, long time to conserve these forests or coral reefs or, any other ecosystem you can think about. But without proper compensation for the countries in which these tropical forests reside, it's just not going to happen, simply because the costs of cutting down these forests or the benefits of cutting those forests far outweigh the benefits of keeping them in many places. And that is what I think is the biggest thing that is so unique about the Tropical Forest Forever Fund, is that for the first time we're actually compensating and paying countries and communities to keep their forests standing. A lot of the work that we're doing on tropical forests over the past 10, 15 years is, carbon markets and all sorts of other things. But this is just direct payments to keep what is a global public good in place for humanity, for all of us. So I think that's the first really big thing. I think the second exciting thing is that it's long-term, and it's already been mentioned, right? This is not short-term payments. As WWF, we have been involved in all sorts of financial mechanisms for tropical forests. I mentioned carbon markets, payments for ecosystem services has been around for a long, long time. PFPs, there are all sorts of really cool and interesting. In fact, in Brazil and Belém, in addition to launching the TFFF, we also launched ARPA Communities, ARPA Comunidades, which is also a really exciting payments mechanism to keep forests standing. But this is long-term, and we need long-term compensation when you're talking about conservation. Conservation is not short-term. You're in it for the long term. And then I think the third thing that has been mentioned as well, this is truly a blended finance model, right? It's governments, but I think the ratio is 1 to 4, isn't it, of public money to getting private investors in. I mean, how cool is that, right? We're actually setting up a mechanism that makes it interesting for everybody to join. Everybody who's interested in investments and getting a return and contributing to a better world, how can you say no to that? And then the last thing I really want to highlight, and again, it's been mentioned, but is the fact that local communities and indigenous groups can have access to this money. If you look at tropical forests, we've got hundreds and hundreds of indigenous groups and local tribes living across the world. This fund isn't just for the Amazon, right? This fund is for, I think it's 60 countries with tropical forests, but the biggest ones, of course, being the Amazon tropical rainforest. The second biggest one is the Congo Basin, and I just want to say a few words about that. Congo Basin, second largest forest in the world, 98% of the forest still standing, which is what makes it unique, okay? As opposed to 18% of the Amazon already being deforested. The Congo Basin, hugely important part of this world, lots of biodiversity, and again, lots of local communities living there. And then you've got Borneo, which is the third one in Southeast Asia, and in Indonesia. So this is what we're talking about, and these indigenous people this is their home. It's as simple as that. But they are also the best stewards of conservation and their natural resources. So setting up this model where we can have indigenous groups and local communities being compensated and directly accessing this fund, I think is probably one of the most innovative things and one of the most important things to do. Because unless we compensate and we support the people who are living and working in the places we're trying to conserve, there's no way this can ever be sustainable. So sustainable finance is important, but ownership and sustainable actions and activities on the ground just as important.
Thank you. And thinking of other sort of funds that have been talked about, and you've mentioned that you've been working on that for a long time as well. Like, for example, the Kali Fund, right, that came out of COP16, or even Oceans Funds. Do you think that if TFFF proves to be successful, can we use that model for other potential investments into nature?
I mean, absolutely. I think for all the reasons we were discussing here, this at this moment with the knowledge we have is absolutely the way to go. I will say, purely from our perspective, there's still a long way to go, right? So we're sitting here really excited, and we all are, but we still have, we really need to step up. We need to get to 10 billion by the end of this year. We're aiming for 125 billion. And that's just the financial side. We also need to make sure that governments are ready to actually access the funds, that communities are ready to actually receive and access the funds. So it's a lot of work on the financial side, but also on the guardrails and making sure that we set up the right governance mechanisms and systems and processes. So for me, I think what's really important is let's make sure and let's put all our effort. I mean, we as WWF are deeply committed to this, making sure that we work with governments all over the world, getting other partners on board, working on the ground with local communities to set up the kind of structures that we need. And let's make this a success first, and then let's see how we can apply it across other biomes as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's what we're all focused on this year. Christophe, over to you from a more, let's put sort of the investor hat, if I may, with your background in private banking. How excited are you about this as a prospect of a sort of long-term investment, also when you think about family offices and patient capital, as I mentioned earlier?
I think I should say, to be very honest, that at first I wasn't excited at all. As a banker in a very conservative institution for many years, we are trained to keep well away from anything to do with junior tranches. So a bit of a surprise maybe to see me here enthusiastically advocating here, and indeed to the people that come to me and ask me. I do think this is very, very exciting, and it's an idea that makes a lot of sense. And has a lot of resonance, I think, for three main reasons. First, it's very efficient. I think you alluded to perhaps to make it very simple, the leverage, as you call it. I call it unlocking. Let's say, every euro or every dollar that you put in unlocks, as you said, the four other dollars. I think that's something that is unique, as you all alluded to. Very simply, it's also an idea that in a way, blended finance is pretty innovative, and it's an idea that is coming now very much to the world of foundations and family offices. First, because I think you see this incredible transfer of wealth occurring right now. This never happened at this scale before, and we actually conducted, Pictet conducted a survey last year, and amongst the 18 to 25-year-olds of our clients, it was actually quite interesting when you ask them what would be with their wealth the biggest, how do they see them, because drivers for change. The results came out actually with you could affect change through the businesses that their family might own, through the investments that they would make, approximately 40% each, and grants and philanthropy only, as donors, only 20%. So that shows, I think, a big change from their parents' generation and the way they see their money being put to use for affecting change. And then the other thing, which is, it's a survey we didn't do, but it's amongst the 17,000 family offices. We let someone else do that survey. And we saw that approximately 75%, a bit less, 73% of the family offices are now actively involved in structuring the way the families make their philanthropic contributions to the causes that interest them. And so both the younger generations and the family offices, they really do want a much more efficient, structured way of making their donations. And I think blended finance in general and the TFFF in particular answers this very much. And I think the last point I would make is that, as opposed to why this one as opposed to another one, clearly I think you probably all read the Economist articles, make it very simple at the end of the year, or the time of the COP. It is just so much more efficient to preserve existing forests, standing forests, than to go and do reforestation projects. I actually came into this world a little bit through reforestation projects. Several family offices asked me, since you have a Brazilian link, can you help us, see which are the good ones and which are the ones we should contribute to? And I spent sort of sabbatical like you last year in Brazil and going to see many projects, thanks to some of the people standing in this room here, or sitting in this room. And they're amazing projects, and some of them very sustainable. But it is incredibly capital intensive. I think there's a lot of trial and error going into this, and it's just so much more efficient to preserve what you have than to go and repair the damage.
Thank you. And that sort of leads me on back to Brazil, really, because you were saying, all the projects and what needs to be done on the ground. And I think Brazil, you're in a unique position of both being an investing country, but also a receiving country, right? I mean, we heard about the tipping points of the Amazon and the deforestation. What happens when the Amazon reaches the 20% deforestation? You suddenly tip into this savannization, and you lose all these ecosystems, and a lot of people will lose livelihoods. The whole breadbasket of the Rio Plata basin collapses, and you suddenly have a huge migration issue at hand as well, right? So from a Brazilian government perspective, you've got a lot of crises you're dealing with. So one, you've got the investment, but what about the receiving of the funds, and how do you envision using those effectively for long-term infrastructure planning as well?
Yeah, and not only all of these problems that you mentioned, but also our agriculture, which feeds in a great part of the world, depends on the water and rain patterns that are produced by the forest. So, I mean, a lot is at stake, not just local communities and their own livelihood, which are very important as well. We have, since the very beginning, took a principle that, let countries decide how they're going to spend whatever amount they get from TFFF, because they will know better how to adjust to their own reality and what policies work in the ground and what others don't. So this was very important. Also a discussion about sovereignty, right? We didn't want someone from somewhere across the world telling each country what they should do. As long as they deliver results, and as long as they show that they're not using the proceeds in any deviant way, that is fine. And one of the beauties of this idea is that the results can be easily measured by some independent satellite imaging that today you can find a number of companies that do that already. So being very honest, I'm from the finance side of the government, finance ministry. I'm not the environmental expert to say we should be doing this or that, but we do have a menu of options in Brazil as for paying for environmental services, providing financing that has conditionalities linked to keeping the forest standing. Carbon markets were just approved legislation recently that will start pricing those things as well. So, I mean, it could be used hiring additional public servants, hiring other monitoring mechanisms and technology. There's tens of options. But I mean, Brazil has managed to bring down deforestation twice, and coincidentally in the government of President Lula. So it can be done, but it's also a increasingly marginal cost. It means that, reducing deforestation from 1% to 0.5%, that's perfectly doable, to 0.4%, 0.3% still. But when you start to get to that threshold where you're approaching zero, then the costs go up really. And that, I think, is something that countries cannot afford to do on their own. And that is why, I mean, we think that this may seem like paying $4 per hectare is not this huge amount of money. But for Brazil, for example, which is one of the countries that most invests in environmental policies to stop this sort of process, it's going to mean 4 times the national budget that is allocated to this purpose. So can you imagine that? I mean, it's kind of like increasing the receipts of your company fourfold. It can certainly have an impact and make that a difference necessary to reach that final mile that we need to get to. So, but honestly, I don't have an answer to you saying which policy we're going to adopt. there is a vast menu for that.
No, and that would be too detailed at the moment anyway, but thank you for that oversight, because I think it's important to remember, again, you know, the issues that go on the ground is not just the deforestation, but it's also the illegal deforestation, right? And having the people that are on the front line are threatened and often end up being killed because they're trying to protect their environment. And that's why these payments are so crucially important, so that these people also have financial protection to do what they do. But moving on to other, and I want to come back to you, Charlotte, because I know obviously what we're trying to highlight here is the incredible benefits and the excitement around it. We have obviously, there has been criticism in the press. Some people have sort of, you know, they've said that $4 is not enough per hectare, or that the model that you were explaining is not going to work and it's too risky. And do you want to maybe address a couple of those criticisms we've received over the last months and maybe debunk them if possible?
I would be happy to. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of noise in it, and some of it's actually just very interesting to me psychologically. So I think you highlighted one big criticism, which is that it is too risky. And I will sit here candidly and say, I said risky bonds. These are not bonds that are without risk. There will be defaults. There will be recoveries. And there will be excess spread learned along the way. My industry has been doing this for a long time, right? There is, you know, asset management. This is what we do. People have been investing in corporate bonds and emerging market bonds for a really long time. And you have to think about the risk reward. You have to think about how much spread you are getting relative to the underlying assets. You have to think about whether that's an appropriate amount of excess spread. You have to think about what the risks that you are taking on are, how to manage them, and how to harvest that return. This is what we do. This is what finance does. And so it's very interesting to me to hear that this is being likened to gambling, when I just think it is what investing is like. 40 years, again, is a really long time, and it's going to have to go through a lot of cycles. And I think that's the other reason why it is set up to use spread bonds and not use coupons as a whole, because I do think that was offered as a solution. People said, well, okay, don't invest in risky assets, invest in risk-free assets and earn the risk-free rate. But the reason not to do that is just here in the title. $4 a hectare a year consistently, every year. That's what it takes to fund conservation. That's what it takes to preserve this enormously important asset. If you had done that in risk-free assets, you would not have gotten there in almost every single year after the GFC, because rates were too low. Excess spread is always there to be harvested. Coupon is not. And the design behind this facility had to take into account not just market conditions today or where we think they may be at the end of this year, but where they are going to be 40 years from now. And that's one of the reasons that it was designed this way. I mentioned CLOs earlier. There are CLO platforms, collateralized loan obligations, which do essentially this. They buy loans, corporate loans, they issue bonds to fund it, and they harvest the net excess spread. There are platforms that have been around since the 1990s. They're 30 years old. So again, this is something that finance has seen and has done. You can do it poorly, you can do it well. I assure you, you can do it well, and I assure you the governance is being put in place to do this well. I think that another criticism has been the complexity and the fact that it does use leverage. But again, the normalness is something that I really want to stress. We are here talking about the $25 billion in junior capital, which is what is special. This capital that is willing to sit patiently for 40 years and earn the risk-free rate to do this important work. The $100 billion is so normal. These kinds of assets are desired and bought every day by pension funds, by insurance companies, by ETFs, by all manner of vehicles out there. And so the intention really is once you have this 25, the other 100 comes easily from financial markets naturally. And then I think the last criticism that we've heard a lot is not enough. which I would turn back to my fellow panelists, this doesn't crowd anything out. This is an endowment that's set up. There's no punishment. There's no lien on the forest. It's really just here trying to deliver that payment consistently and does not, I think, prevent other opportunities from being able to step in.
Thank you.
May I jump in 30 seconds? You know, I just want to get to Charlotte's just the specialist, but the way I see it, and we've been selling this, is look, banks have been doing this for hundreds of years, right, if not more. You borrow low and you invest high. You take the risk in the middle and you make a profit out of it. That's it. That is what you do. And they do that sometimes 1 to 8, 1 to 9. That's what Basel regulation. We're proposing them doing that with half of that sort of risk. So, I mean, it can't get any more straightforward and direct than that. But I think that sometimes people don't want to see it that way. We're basically saying we're going to shut up a bank, make a profit. Instead of pocketing the profit, we're going to use it for conservation. That's basically the.
Sounds very simple and understandable to me. I hope the others agree. I'm just going to turn back to you. And do you want to come in and make a comment on that too?
I'll do it first before you answering your question.
Well, I was just, you know, Norway has a unique position. Obviously, you have a huge endowment fund yourself, as it were, a pension fund. So, and there are other countries around the world, maybe not in Europe, maybe in deserted parts of this world that are actually also dependent on the ecosystem of the rainforest continuing because they're experiencing desertification in that area, and with further deforestation that also risks to collapse. So how can one get those governments involved as well when it feels very far away for them, but actually it's really, really crucially important also to their survival? And can Norway play a role, really?
Well, so you started with this, I guess. I mean, tropical deforestation is a systemic risk to the world economy and to every country in the world. The tipping points you mentioned, you see already in Brazil. You can compare the farms that are east and west of a massive indigenous reserves, Xingu, that comes down to the agricultural belt. One side is losing the third harvest, one is not, because there's the water coming directly from that. So you see soy yields going down. You see already impacts from droughts, the 21-22 season. You see already the beginnings of some very dramatic shocks to global commodity production that will impact food prices all over the world. You see the Congo Basin Forest was mentioned. It provides water for the Sahel and for East Africa. It's the water tower of an entire region. If deforestation continues in the Congo Basin, drying up that water service, you will see famine, wars, and migration flows. I'm not trying to be sort of, well, I guess I'm trying to be dramatic. No, but these are real impacts, right? And we're talking here about finding a way for the global community to provide $3 billion a year for rainforest protection. When every country is investing, collectively trillions in defense. So this is a global security risk. So we have to find a way. And it can be through ODA, it could be through carbon markets, or it could be through this approach. But ODA is going down. We have extreme inequality and a lot of wealth. This is one approach of trying to use public money smarter. Investments in the junior tranche is not market terms. It's not risk-free. That's why we have the junior tranche. So let's be clear about that. The senior tranche is market terms. Our investment is not. And we're not using our sovereign wealth fund for this, because the sovereign wealth fund's mandate is to maximize profits for a given risk from Parliament with the reference portfolio from Ministry of Finance. So that's not the pocket we are using. We're using public funding to finance the junior tranche because it's so important to do this. And then we're de-risking the private sector so that the private sector can come in on its terms, right? So we're not trying to sort of convince the private sector that there is a profit no one has thought about before. We're actually de-risking this investment. And that's what this is about.
Thank you. And I think this brings it to you were talking about food prices and the geopolitical risk that is with it. And I think a lot of people are not making that connection enough. So I was listening to a podcast the other day and they were talking about the inflation of food prices in Germany. And they were like, yeah, the food prices have gone down, but chocolate and coffee have stayed very high. Like, yeah, because they are threatened by climate change. But that didn't come up with the discussion, right? And I think at WWF, you've been doing a lot on that front and a lot on how to raise consumer awareness of this. Because as you say, it's the Rio de Plata Basin provides food to millions of people, and it would completely destabilize the entire food system, global commodity prices. How do we get that into the minds of the consumer as well, to understand why their governments are using that public money to go into that?
Yeah, one thing that we have learned is, again, over the decades of, let's say, the conservation movement, is it started very much from a more protective perspective, right? You protect nature from people. We built protected areas, national parks. That was very much, let's say, 60, 70 years ago. That's the Western conservation. I'm not talking about all the many other conservation movements around the world that have existed for hundreds and thousands of years. But and where we are right now is that we need to really find a way to conserve nature with people, and so putting people right at the center. And it speaks to what we were talking about, locally led conservation, making sure that fishermen, farmers, indigenous groups are, the leaders and the stewards of the nature we're trying to protect. But equally, to me, locally led conservation is speaking to the many consumers and I would say conservationists across the globe who sit outside of those tropical forests. And I think the shift that we're making is it's not just about giving money. Right, that's the other big shift we're making, where philanthropy and NGOs like WWF have focused a lot on fundraising. At this moment, we're saying, giving money is really important. It's really important because that's the way we can invest in projects and conserve. But it's equally important to look at the food you eat and how that impacts. If you look at, the biggest drivers of forest loss in the Brazilian Amazon is beef production and soy. Those are key ingredients in the food we eat all over the world. So thinking about what you eat is really important. How, plastics is another huge important, how do you, finding ways to clean plastics. So all I'm trying to say is that that's a big shift of the conservation movement that we're into, is making sure that every single person has a role to play in protecting our forests and coral reefs and everything else. The other thing I just wanted to say, I know it's a different topic, I just want to say about the previous conversation we were having about the importance and the sustainability of these funds. So we have a lot of experience, and this is not from the financial perspective, but just from the conservation perspective, a lot of experience. And to me, one of the greatest examples is actually the ARPA model that we set up 25 years ago with the Brazilian government, the Amazon Regional Protected Areas. And now going into a phase 2 called doing the same thing with communities. So an article was published a couple of years ago where the ARPA model, which sets out to protect various parts of the Amazon through a PFP model, through basically an endowment fund, no matter what government was there, the protected areas that were funded by the ARPA 1 are still standing. So while deforestation has gone up in large parts of the Amazon, it's the parts of the Amazon that were protected by the PFP model, the Enduring Earth model, are still standing. So what's cool about if you design them correctly, is actually they're very sustainable because they provide a continuity of funds. But most importantly, it's not just about the money. It's about setting up the guardrails, the policies, the institutions that make sure that deforestation cannot place no matter what president is in charge or no matter what government.
Yeah, and that's such a valid point, because moving the money away from a donation bucket where you constantly have to worry about your donation cycle, we were talking about this last night, you have to go, the amount of time you spend fundraising, right, which distracts you from doing the actual work. So you're moving away from having that aid bucket that is unpredictable to a continuous investment that comes in returns. Christoph, I saw you pick up the microphone. Was there something that you wanted to add? You sure?
Fine, no.
Okay, because I was...
Well, actually, since you mentioned it, maybe that's it's not quite related to this one, but it still goes back to the mechanism. I thought those of you who are looking at this, I think one thing worth mentioning is that, of course, versus grants and the fundraising you have to do, this is obviously a much more efficient system, but it's still in its infancy in terms of many of the tax regulators. So whereas you have some regimes, and Singapore will be an example, and I think in the US, starting to as well, where blended finance instruments have a more favorable tax treatment. In Europe, which is probably one of the biggest sources, apart from the US, of funding for nature causes, we're still way back. Grants are much more favorably viewed. So that's something that I think it's one of the challenges that we'll see, in that we're seeing also some of others relocating some of their entities through which they do donations because of this.
That's a really valid point. Thank you for raising that. And that's for those of you in the room working in government. Please keep in mind. Anyway, I thought, yes, exactly. I thought I'd open the room to questions now. And I already see a hand being raised there. So 2 hands. Let me see. I'll come around with a microphone.
Thank you so much. Dr. Stanislav Edward Shmelev, founder and CEO of Environment Europe Foundation and a member of the Club of Rome. I'm really impressed. It's an amazing initiative. I fully agree with the fact that bonds could be a really viable instrument and building block of this. I would like to complement the discussion slightly and ask you a question about scientific data and monitoring, because what we really need to invest very hard, especially in places like Africa, and South America as well, we're working on Trans-Sahara project right now, is measurement and monitoring of the ecosystems and the complexity of these ecosystems that exist there now. And I'm talking about the diversity, the pollinators, the soils, all the water flows and so on. And also monitoring on a regular basis. Because the article we've just published on Indonesia and the biodiversity offsets and the deforestation shows, based on evidence from all around the world, that this is really the weakest point. And nothing is being monitored on a regular basis, and there's often also a very fixed lifetime of some of those instruments that were practiced in a form of biodiversity offsets. So if you could comment on the data and the monitoring. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know whether, one of you wants to come in, and maybe you want to add something too.
Oh, sorry. No one. So we've been working on this for almost 2 decades on improving monitoring alongside a lot of others. There's been a quiet revolution in our ability to monitor tropical rainforests. When we started, every 5 years, countries would submit a report to FAO, self-reported data. Now you have Global Forest Watch. We provided the satellite imagery, high-resolution imagery, free of charge for the whole tropical belt for the last 4 years. And we're looking at renewing that. We have domestic capabilities that have improved a lot, using global data and then adapting it to their own needs. Brazil has been a leader in this from the outset. So biodiversity can be hard to monitor. So we're actually a bit skeptical of international biodiversity credits. It could be done in local context. But this is not that. This is monitoring tropical rainforest for all their services. And it's simplified compared to what those challenges are that you mentioned. So the monitoring side, we have zero doubt that this is credible. And there will be a mix of global top-down and bottom-up systems, but they will all be subject to scrutiny for being good enough. And that goes to Joao's point as well. Why would we mobilize resources and let countries kind of decide what to do with them? Well, because we can see that what works, right? And you have examples of countries that have shown what works in terms of what public policies are successful. But this incentive structure rewards what works. And it stops payments if it doesn't work. And then you have certain guardrails of how to spend the money on local communities and indigenous peoples. But beyond that, this is a sort of a hands-off approach that allows us to have a partnership with countries without dictating their policies, but being certain that we only pay for success and that it goes to finance further success.
Do you want to add anything?
Nothing more. I mean, exactly what I was going to say. We've been aided. It's been really hard to monitor biodiversity, as you know, especially tropical forests, because you can't do it all from satellites, right? Because it's so dense. But this is where technology has really, really helped us. And I will say, and you mentioned this as well, we have to ground truth truth that as well with on-the-ground communities. So citizen science and all that kind of stuff is also becoming bigger and bigger. But I think it speaks to the point that we've made as well, that in addition to setting up the financial side of this work, we have to make sure that we get all the other parts correct as well. And like I said, the technological, I mean, just spending a little bit of time in China every once in a while, it is incredible what is happening there on biodiversity conservation. You can imagine with some of the technology that's being developed there on biodiversity. So drones, you name it. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd just like to compliment this. I was on a call also the other day with the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute. And as you probably know, they've been, in Panama for 150 years and collecting data. And the digital transition they're going through in order to monitor biodiversity on the ground through noises of animals, bird song, etc. It's revolutionary. And I think the success of this is going to rely obviously on the partnerships with those kind of organizations as well as people on the ground. And what I saw when I was in Brazil, I mean, the innovation coming out of Brazil is mind-blowing as well. Together with the technology in China. So I think we're in a very good spot. And that's also why this is such a great moment for this to be launched. Any other questions you had?
Thank you very much. I am Luciana Mujia from Bolivia. I work with an economic media leader there. And I also lead a platform from top innovators from the Amazon working on biodiversity preservation. And I have one question, is a lot of capital is being mobilized for climate and nature, of course, yet very little translates into resilient forest economics. I have seen it across the Amazon. And what do you see as a missing link? Which kind of platforms or actors do you trust to turn this global finance into a measurable outcomes for people and ecosystems? What will be the next generation, for example, move to have real outcomes? Thank you.
I'm happy to speak generally, but not on the, maybe not so much, but on the Amazon specifically. I think as I was mentioning before, the biggest shift that we have to make is making sure that we're focusing on not just top-down initiatives of protected areas and national parks, but making sure that we set up initiatives together with local communities. And so for me, everything that we've been doing over the past decades is around making sure that communities are organized on the ground. Some of it is, if we're talking about Congo Basin, I'm sure it's the same in parts of the Amazon. If we're talking about Congo Basin, a lot of the conservation work that we're doing, talking about putting money around, right? We're literally, as WWF, sending money on the back of motorbikes to communities to get compensated, right? So how do we make sure we set up local governance mechanisms, bank accounts, financial systems? It's basic stuff like that that I think is at this moment what's most important. So that's laying the ground. And then I think, as we're doing with the ARPA communities, which I think, again, is still a good example of how it can be translated to economic benefits on the ground, a lot of it is focusing on solar panels, right? Making sure that local communities and economies can function with access to energy, right? Again, we're aided by a huge drop in the cost of solar panels, which can now be done as well. It's access to markets. So there is a lot of communities, as you know, that are producing amazing stuff, whether it's non-timber forest products or other things. How can we give them access to markets? So it's really basic stuff. But I think the most important thing, we've been doing this for a long time, as you say as well. The most important thing is that we make this an integral part of the planning and the design of the program. And I think we have great examples to learn from for the TFFF as well to do that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and if you want to also, I've just been given some more information. So one of the people who's been most involved in doing the outreach to the indigenous people is a Peruvian lady at the World Bank. And that she was just texting and saying that, their focus this year, we've got the focus to raise the money, but their focus is really to set up a global advisory council with all these people where exactly those things are being addressed and talked about this year. So there's very careful, slowly consideration on that process. I'm going to pass the microphone on to you.
Thank you. Frederick Albert of Carbon Pool, we're the first insurance company dedicated only to covering the carbon markets. And as such, I think about the carbon markets a lot. Could you give us a little bit of color on how you see TFFF coexisting with, complementing existing market-based mechanisms like voluntary or regulatory carbon markets, as well as maybe even the fledgling biodiversity markets?
Yeah, I can take that one. Again, since the beginning, we knew that we did not want to invade other initiatives, and we wanted to build something that it does exactly that, builds on what exists. So we found that there was a small failure in this forest financing or carbon financing mechanisms, because you do have sort of private financing through carbon markets of reforestation, because you can integrity issues are still there, but it's quite, easy to see that there is additionality when you are reforesting, you're taking carbon out of the atmosphere. There are other initiatives, such as REDD+ programs, that help reduce deforestation on the margin. And that is something that Norway has supported a lot. That's what the Amazon Fund does, and that has actually achieved a lot of success. But again, that does not solve the problem of a country that either has a large stock of forests, and it's not losing any of their forests, or a country that has zero deforestation. And what are then the incentives for this country? If they're only going to get paid if they reduce deforestation and they reach zero, then the incentives are go back and take everything down again so you can start getting paid again for reduction. So you want to pay for the stock. It makes a lot more sense. It's cheaper, as we were saying. I mean, you work with this, you probably know this well, but thousands of dollars to invest per hectare into making those trees grow up back again and absorb carbon. And that's why carbon prices fluctuate around $70 to $100, and you get, 300, 400 tons of carbon per hectare. So we're talking about $20,000. That you might be getting for reforestation, while here you're getting paid $4. But again, to do something that is a lot simpler and easier, it's just don't go into the forest. So yeah, each of these mechanisms aims at solving one type of problem, and I think we're just adding another one at a very large scale, of course, and that does have the benefit of being simple. I mean, again, we're not measuring carbon, we're not measuring biodiversity, we're measuring a hectare, because we know that if it is an intact hectare of forest, it does have carbon, it does have biodiversity. I don't need to go there and do all this complex accounting and comparing, a bird to a tree or how much carbon there is in there. So that's another upside of the whole story.
I happen to trade carbon markets in my day job. So I think something that I would sort of add on that front, and we have traded compliance markets for years. Voluntary markets have not achieved scale yet. And that is absolutely an interesting topic and something I hope is discussed this week. But they're sort of not on the scale to solve all of the rainforest in the world. And as you said, sort of the time is now really to prevent further deforestation. So I think the goal with this was to have that scale, to have it efficiently and have it quickly by crowding in private capital, but not crowd out carbon markets now that you do have initiatives to have more integrity, now that you have the ICVCM and you have these higher standards, as we can sort of reestablish registries for avoided deforestation. They would be able to come in. This wouldn't prevent any of those programs from really growing and developing, but would sort of, I think, quickly blanket the markets and capital.
And if, you want to add, yes?
Yeah, just a brief comment there. So I think, I see Erin is in the room. I mentioned Leaf Coalition earlier. We do see a huge need for scaling up jurisdictional REDD, the jargon, but supporting countries and large jurisdictions to reduce deforestation. So we're working on TFFF aggressively, but it's going to take a few years before countries get the money there. and we have a very tight carbon budget when it comes to deforestation. There's a huge interest in the food and land use sector to reduce supply chain emissions. There's no reason they should not join up and approach the government of Mato Grosso or Indonesia or what have you to say, we want to partner with you to reduce your emissions, reduce our scope 3 emissions in the meantime. There's a misallocation of capital, in my view. I'm not against reforestation. I think it's hugely important that it gets private investment. But there's no reason you should pay $100 per ton for reforesting instead of protecting, reducing the destruction of the tropical rainforests at 10.
Yeah, because that lost carbon has a cost. And there's actually a calculation of the deforestation of last year. The lost carbon is 125 billion, which is what we're trying to raise here. So that puts it into a nice perspective. I think I need to, one last question. We've got,
I will just thank you, Christopher, for inviting, because it's really very close to my heart. I was brought to the World Bank in '95 for environmental department by a very good Brazilian lady, Marita Professor, who many of you may know. And she told me that if you look on the things why they're not working, you need to look also on the indigenous people and on the private sector, beyond government. And in 2007, the World Bank, IFC, was trying to create the Earth Fund, and I was asked to come back from the World Economic Forum to Washington to be the head of this fund. And I said, unless you have a ratio 1:4 in the governance, where 4 people who are bringing money, private sector and indigenous people, are matched with 1 person from the governance would not be so efficient, because those who are really putting the money, and I'm talking from the perspective not just World Bank, World Economic Forum, but the family officer, they would not put the money unless they feel confident. So how you would see this as the initial idea that we all live downstreams, because everyone depends on someone, but how those people who need to put money and to have some incentives and taxes could be engaged in designing this process beyond just the ODA, and my great respect to WWF, and we discussed with Claude Martin many years ago. So how to move from this intergovernmental multilateral discussion to real private-public community effort in the Amazon. So to combine incentives, taxes, etc., because there are plenty of people who will be willing to put 50 million, like Christopher and who we discussed, in these things like this. It goes beyond Christopher. I'm just saying that it's important to be the first taker advantage, but you see, the people who have the money, they have some heart, and they want to put the money where they will see some return, not only in the humanitarian point, but for themselves. You see, this is how you bring this Wall Street and Green Street together, because I think what Christopher was saying, taxes, incentives, should encourage people to invest in this great effort, which I fully...
Thank you. Thank you for that question. I don't know whether one of you wants to answer it. We have been discussing this, so to put your mind at rest, there are discussions at the moment of what the role those investors, those high net worth individuals or philanthropic investors can play in this early stage. Obviously, there's the governments that are putting together the steering committee at the moment. So that is definitely being addressed. There is no answer to it yet, but I agree with you that they need to be involved. And I don't know whether Andreas or João, you've got anything else to add for that. At the moment, it's the government's driving the setup of it and the structure, but we do obviously want them to be actively involved as well in the forming.
No, I mean, yes, governments are driving it because we can't fool ourselves. This junior tranche will come. This is a policy money. This is money that is going to be oriented for for reaching some goals in terms of public policy. But since the beginning, we have been involving the banking community, so not exactly foundations, but the banking community, and they've been looking at this. And they, for example, were the ones that told us many of the things that Charlie just said here, for example, that this money will come in naturally once you have that credit enhancement or that equity coming from juniors. We have involved indigenous communities since the very beginning. That's how it ended up with the 20% part of the proceeds going directly to indigenous people. We have not, and this is true, we have not involved foundations, not high net worth individuals directly, but I guess this is kind of like what we're doing now. I mean, we're coming out in the open and saying, this is the idea, criticize it, offer better solutions, and we'll, you know, it's not craft in stone yet. We can still make changes. Please, you know, tell us what you need, what makes sense to you.
Thank you. And in the name of time, I will close punctually because it is 11 o'clock and everybody's probably got other meetings to rush off to. Thank you so, so much. I hope we've converted you all into TFFF ambassadors now. All hands on deck are needed and we need to raise 10 billion. Thank you very much and have a good day.